Hi everybody, welcome back. This is Mrs. Wilson, and today we're going to be looking at the effects of the War of 1812. Yesterday we looked at the causes of the War of 1812, such as the alliance with Tecumseh, the Native Americans that helped fight against the United States, also the seizing and capturing of U.S. sailors by the British Navy, otherwise known as impressment, and also the seizing and capturing of U.S. cargo by the British Navy. We're also going to look at how those factors led to ultimately a main effect of the War of 1812, and that was an increase in U.S. manufacturing. Our essential question is, how did the War of 1812 unite us? In other words, how did it unite us? How did it create a sense or feeling of nationalism or pride in our nation? So America's reaction after all the things that were happening to us as a result of Great Britain impressing our sailors, stealing our cargo, forming alliances with Native Americans in the Great Lakes region to fight against America and people that were beginning to settle west. And as a result of this, James Madison, early on didn't want to take sides. He really wanted to remain neutral, trying to follow in the footsteps of his predecessors, George Washington, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson, by not getting involved in more battles. But this was becoming overwhelming, and he, as a result of staying neutral, Congress is going to pass something called the Embargo Act, which puts trade restrictions on any trade between America and Great Britain. It's going to close all American ports to British ships. American ships are no longer allowed to sail to British ports to drop off all their raw materials, so that Great Britain can take those raw materials and make them into manufactured products. And because there's such a close-knit relationship between these two countries, they're their number one trade partners, it's going to devastate the U.S. economy. And our economy is going to crash. Businesses will start to go out of business. And so it becomes a very, very unpopular method of punishing Great Britain. But it does, those that supported the war wanted to go to war because they were tired of America being really bullied at sea. I really don't know how else to say it. The main reason they wanted to go to war was to gain that freedom at sea, gain freedom of shipping, of sailing across the Atlantic Ocean and trading with other countries. Great Britain is still trying to behave as though they are not only the masters of the sea, but the masters of the United States. And the United States was starting to get pretty sick and tired of it. They were a legitimate country, and they wanted to be recognized as a legitimate country by Great Britain. Those who were against the war were many New Englanders that relied on trade with Great Britain. They were already devastated by the embargo of 1807 that cut off all the trade, closed the ports to British ships, and war would just make that worse. And so merchants and businessmen really didn't want to go to war with with Great Britain under any circumstances, regardless of British taking and capturing American sailors. What happens, though, is James Madison really kind of steps up to the plate, and he's tired as president of taking a neutral stance, and decides that war really is the only outcome. The United States, if they are going to be recognized by anyone as a legitimate nation, they can't allow themselves to be pushed around and their entire trade system be compromised because Great Britain is capturing their cargo and taking their sailors and putting them in British naval vessels. That if they're going to gain any respect from anybody, they're going to have to begin to fight back. And so the United States, although a very weak military at this time, engaged in war. It only had 16 ships, fewer than 7,000 very poorly trained men, very little equipment, very, very few experienced officers. So they're not in the greatest position to fight, but nonetheless, a war did take place, and those battles were concentrated primarily along the Great Lakes area, those 5 Great Lakes areas, Washington, D.C., Louisiana, especially the port of New Orleans, and of course the Mississippi River, which is our main trading artery or river highway in the United States at that time. And of course here in red you see British ships that have blockaded all of America's ports, which will especially hurt these New England businessmen and business owners up here. They can't get troops, they can't get supplies out of their ports, and they can't get supplies into their ports. And that's going to have a devastating impact on the economy. This war is also known for dramatic battles at sea. This really is going to be a battle where we have ships fighting one another on the high seas. And the USS Constitution is known as Old Ironsides because it's able to repel 18-pound British cannonballs that would simply bounce right off its sides. And it's not necessarily because the ship was made of iron, because it wasn't, but it was made of really, 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 really super hard wood that the New England forests are known for, and that really super hard wood, multi-layered wood, was able to repel those British cannonballs. And it was a lifesaver, really and truly. And as a result, actually the ship is still in active service. It is the oldest naval ship in the United States Navy and sits in the harbor in Boston. So if you ever have an opportunity to go to Boston, by all means, see if you can take a tour on the USS Constitution. Oliver Hazard Perry defeated the British on Lake Erie. This gave us control of Lake Erie, and he's known for saying, "We have met the enemy and they are ours." So he was able to capture and defeat the enemy on Lake Erie. As I showed you in the map, Britain is going to blockade the eastern seaboard, preventing any ships from leaving or entering those port cities. The White House will be burned down in August 1814, when British forces sailed into the Chesapeake Bay and invade and capture Washington, D.C. President Madison's wife, Dolly, is going to gather any important papers she can, and especially gather and take the first presidential portrait of George Washington, or the only presidential portrait of George Washington, and flee to the south. And the White House will burn down, and a good many buildings in Washington, D.C. will also burn down. The British then moved to attack Fort McHenry at Baltimore, Maryland. The city was completely unprepared for invaders, but as I said earlier, about Dolly Madison, she's the only one, she's the first one to take action in retaining and saving important things in the White House, again, capturing and saving the portrait of George Washington. The Battle of Fort McHenry, the commander of Fort McHenry requested a large flag so the British will have no difficulty seeing it. This was a massive, massive flag. It is on display in, it takes up, if I had it unfurled in my classroom and spread out, it would take up my entire classroom. It's on display in in the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. But at the end of the Battle of Fort McHenry, that flag was still visible, although it was shot up and destroyed in some areas. It was still visible, which demonstrated that America had actually won this Battle of Fort McHenry. And there's a short video after this presentation that you can watch over that battle. Francis Scott Key was on board a ship in the in the harbor of Baltimore. He was actually on a British ship, and he was on a British ship for other reasons. And while he sat and watched the bombardment of Fort McHenry, He wasn't sure what the outcome would be at the end of that bombardment of Fort McHenry, but when he woke up the next morning, or after, well, not woke up necessarily, but after watching that battle all night long, and saw that once the smoke cleared, that that huge flag was still flying at Fort McHenry, and he was so touched by that he keyed or wrote the lyrics to our Star Spangled Banner, which then eventually became our national anthem. The Treaty of Ghent is what eventually ends the War of 1812. Signed in December 1814, the war, for all practical purposes, really ended in a tie. There was no party that gained or lost any territory. America didn't gain any new territory, and Great Britain didn't gain any territory in the United States. But the issue of impressment of sailors, it also was not addressed. But eventually it just kind of disappeared on its own, even though the treaty didn't specifically get rid of it. So this is a signing of the Treaty of Ghent in 1814, ending the War of 1812, which for all practical purposes ended in a stalemate. After the treaty was signed and after the war was over, communication is pretty slow getting out to other parts of the country, especially the Louisiana area. And so there's still fighting going on there. The Battle of New Orleans actually is the last battle of the War of 1812, and it happens after the Treaty of Ghent, as I said earlier. The British prepared to attack New Orleans and cut off American trade on the Mississippi, but Andrew Jackson, former President Andrew Jackson, was waiting for the British, and Jackson's American soldiers defeated the British at New Orleans. You also got some help from pirates, and one famous pirate, Jean Lafitte, whose home is in Galveston, Texas, and is a museum to this day. But he even enlisted the help of pirates that worked the Gulf of Mexico to help defeat Great Britain. The effects of the Battle of New Orleans, the final most deadly battle for the British, was by Andrew Jackson. He is going to become a hero, and that notoriety that he gains as the hero of New Orleans will help him in the future, about 15 years later, to become President of the United States. The War of 1812 is remembered for dramatic sea battles. Those naval battles that I talked about earlier is what this battle, or what this war is specifically known for. Its effects are that it weakened Native Americans, especially in the Great Lakes area. The war broke the strength of Native American tribes any tribes that sided with Great Britain. Another effect that it is going to encourage U.S. manufacturing once they realize, as a result of all the blockading of American ports and the inability to get manufactured goods from Great Britain, that the United States is going to have to depend on itself from here on out and make its own manufactured products. And over the course of the 1800s, America is going to become the number one manufacturing powerhouse in the whole world. And so by 1900, we are the number one world leading manufacturing giant. The third effect is that it proved that the United States was a military power, and for the second time it had defeated Great Britain. And that's a pretty big they're 2-0 against Great Britain, and that's an amazing accomplishment by a very young nation. It also encouraged a sense of pride and nationalism in the United States. Many Americans felt confident about their new nation. It created feelings of patriotism, and for the first time, people are feeling more like Americans and less like New Yorkers or Virginians or Pennsylvanians. Now they truly identify themselves as Americans first and identify themselves by their states second. So now it is your turn. I'd like you to answer the discussion questions that follows this presentation, and also follows 3 short videos about